So next, we will hear from Dr. Rebecca Portnoff, VP of Data Science at Thorn, with Safety by Design for Generative AI Preventing Child Sexual Abuse. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the welcome. My name is Dr. Rebecca Portnoff. I'm Vice President of Data Science and AI at Thorn. Thorn is a nonprofit that defends children from sexual abuse by building technology, conducting research, and collaborating with the ecosystem. I've personally been working in this intersection of AI and child safety for over the last decade. I hold a PhD from UC Berkeley and a bachelor's from Princeton, both in computer science. At Thorn, I lead a team that builds our machine learning and AI technology to support our mission by accelerating victim identification, stopping re-victimization, and preventing abuse. I also lead our efforts on safety by design, partnering with the broader ecosystem to ensure that technologies are not used to facilitate child sexual exploitation and abuse. So I am very glad to have the opportunity to speak with this group today on generative AI and its misuse in furthering sexual harms against children, as well as what we can do to prevent this abuse from occurring. I do want to note that we will be discussing some heavy and challenging content in this presentation, and so I encourage you to do what you need to do to support your wellness during the session. The fact of the matter is that childhood has changed. Technology is now intertwined in our children's daily lives. And while this technology creates many, many positive opportunities that previous generations never had, it also creates new risks and threats that require new defenses. And the reality is that those on the defense are currently overwhelmed. Decades ago, the distribution of a child's abuse imagery, what we refer to as child sexual abuse material, or CSAM, it was slower and less expansive. Typical pathways for sharing this material would be offenders directly mailing it to each other, sharing via personal networks, or illegal storefronts. The advent and the growth of the internet in the 90s and the early 2000s fundamentally changed this paradigm and removed many of the barriers to harm. As technology developed and advanced, abuse imagery could be uploaded and shared with anybody in the globe in moments. Abuse could now be initiated by anyone from anywhere in the world. Now, the full scale of online child sexual abuse and exploitation and the volume of resulting abuse imagery is really hard to measure. We only know what we know. Estimates reflect only the abuse material that we have discovered. What is clear is that the child safety ecosystem is already overtaxed, with millions of reports of suspected abuse made annually. This reported content contains both known material, images and videos that have been historically reviewed and flagged as child sexual abuse material by a human analyst, as well as new material that represents images and videos that are being seen and reported for the first time and could depict a child victim that is in an active abuse scenario. To drill into a bit of the specifics, there are alarming trends towards new abuse imagery and more extreme abusive imagery. 40% of minors report that they have experienced an outreach from a stranger, where the stranger immediately solicited nude images from them. Reporting hotlines for child sexual abuse, like the Internet Watch Foundation, similarly share troubling insights. In their 2024 annual report, IWF found a 22% increase in Category A content reported to them compared to the previous year. Category A material is the most severe classification for abuse material, defined as images involving penetrative sexual activity with an animal, or sadism. Now, these harms against children extend past images and videos. Sexual extortion is defined as the act of threatening to distribute private and sensitive sexual material featuring an individual, unless they agree to some type of threat, perhaps sharing more sexual or intimate imagery, favors, or money in the case of financial sexual extortion. In a recent 2024 report, Thorn and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children found that NCMEC received, on average, 812 reports of sexual extortion per week. Further, the FBI has stated that in 2024, it received nearly 55,000 reports of crimes related to sexual extortion, a 59% increase in these reports since 2023, with financial losses in 2024 totaling to over $30 million. These types of scenarios can quickly escalate to truly incredible harms, in some cases leading to a child committing suicide. Similarly, NCMEC shares that in 2024, they observed a 140% increase over the last 2 years in the number of cases reported to them that involved a child that was in imminent danger of physical harm. Now, onto this rather depressing landscape, we now layer in generative AI. Generative AI technologies are sadly being misused today to create sexual content depicting children and to further sexual harms against children. This technology is easy to use, it is easy to access, and it's scalable, producing thousands of images in minutes that is photorealistic. Now, when we consider impact, we provide a three-part framing here, that the misuse of these technologies complicates victim identification, it increases re-victimization, and it reduces barriers to harm. When we talk about victim identification, we need to understand that this is already a needle in the haystack problem for law enforcement. They are navigating many, many reports and related content to try to find a child that is in an active harm's way. Anything that grows that haystack further is going to be a problem. This is particularly troubling given the fact that these technologies produce photorealistic content at scale, making it difficult for law enforcement to reliably determine whether or not the image depicts a child in an abuse scenario or a fictional child that does not exist. This technology also has impact on re-victimization. Offenders will fine-tune broadly shared and open-source generative AI models using existing child sexual abuse material, optimizing these models so that they can generate additional explicit images of these specific children. They are collaborating to build models that produce synthetic images that match the exact likeness of the child, but produce new poses, acts, and egregious content like sexual violence. This type of misuse is possible because offenders can directly download these open source and broadly shared models onto their private desktops, then use, modify, and share these models with limited oversight or restrictions. Finally, offenders are using these new technologies to target more victims at scale and create a wider pool of children that they can target. They enhance and scale their sexual extortion efforts by using generative AI to sexualize benign imagery of children, and then blackmail these kids into either generating more content or paying some kind of financial compensation. There are also increasingly more reports of minor-to-minor harassment and bullying, where minors will generate sexualized content of their peers using these same technologies, commonly referred to as nudifying apps and services. Now again, drilling into the details a bit further, we know from research that 1 in 10 minors share that they already know of cases where their peers are using generative AI to create explicit images of other kids. Earlier this year, the Internet Watch Foundation reported that they had observed a 10% increase over the last year in AI-generated child sexual abuse material that fits that definition of Category A content, based on a snapshot study that they conducted of dark web forums dedicated to the sexual abuse of children. And just last month, the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children shared that when comparing 2024 reports of AI-generated child sexual exploitation and abuse to those received to date in 2025, they have already seen a huge growth from around 7,000 to 440,000. And again, this is more than just images. 11% of reports of sexual extortion to NCMEC in the last year included threatening children with fake sexual imagery. These types of insights are echoed by law enforcement who report that when potential victims refuse to send sexually explicit material, perpetrators now use generative AI to manipulate this content to extort these individuals. Since April 2023, the FBI has observed an uptick in this type of activity. Finally, if we look more globally, according to a study conducted by the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, 50% of law enforcement report that they have encountered AI-generated child sexual abuse material used for the online grooming of minors. Now, you may think I am just here to bum you out, but I am not. I would like to ask each of you to hold 2 competing realities in your mind right now. First, it is very obvious that the cat is out of the bag. These technologies have been built, they have been released, and they are being misused. And second, we do not have to accept this. There are tangible, practical, technical, and policy solutions that can be put in place to prevent this misuse of generative AI in furthering child sexual abuse. It was those 2 competing realities that led me, back in the summer of 2023, to start Thorn and All Tech as Humans Safety by Design for Generative AI initiative. We brought together industry stakeholders in the generative AI technology space, across open source and closed source, and across the AI value chain, those developing it, those providing access to it, as well as key players like search engines and social platforms that accelerate the distribution of not just the synthetic material created by these technologies, but in some cases, the distribution and the hosting of the technologies themselves. Our purpose in bringing these companies together was to have them define, align on, and commit to a set of generative AI safety by design principles to prevent its misuse in furthering child sexual abuse. The principles and recommended mitigations that came out from this work are guidelines that, if followed, will reduce a generative model's capability to produce abuse material, make the material that does get produced more reliably detected, and prevent the distribution of those models, services, and apps that are being used to produce this abuse material. I want to stress that none of these interventions on their own is a silver bullet. This is not that kind of problem. It is really the activation of layered interventions that has impact. In our public launch in April of 2024, the companies who joined in to commit to these principles and to share progress they are making to take action on these principles are listed on the screen. Since then, Invoke AI has also joined into these commitments. Now I'm going to take us through these principles one at a time, so I hope there are some developers and policy folks in the room, because I think you will find this of most interest. Starting with the first, responsibly source and safeguard training data sets from child sexual abuse and exploitation material. Now, models are a function of the training data and the training strategy that is used to build them. So there are currently 2 known pathways for why a foundation or base model can produce AI-generated child sexual abuse material. It either has enough child sexual abuse material used as part of its training process in its training data set so that it can learn the concept of abuse material. Or it's been trained on a combination of adult sexual concepts and benign depictions of children and has learned how to combine these concepts. This phenomena is something sometimes referred to as compositional generalization. So the opportunity we are focusing on in this principle is really in the data, detecting, reporting, and removing abuse and exploitation material from your training data before you build your model. Further, addressing that risk of compositional generalization, and finally, getting at the root of the source, making sure that as you collect your data, as you set up your data collection pipelines, you're doing it in a way that is avoiding training data that is sourced from sites that are known to host child sexual abuse material. The second principle is to incorporate feedback loops and iterative stress testing strategies in the development process. Now, this is already best practice for AI development in general, and certainly it applies to this space as well. Models will get stale, models will hallucinate, and models will have bias. So that user feedback on what went wrong, what went right, is really critical for continuous correction of issues. Stress testing models or red teaming involves attempts to craft a prompt that will trigger a model to generate media that is likely to cause harm, and is another way to engage in this type of principle of activity. Essentially, you're putting on the perspective of an offender, and you're testing to see whether or not they would be able to successfully get your model to generate harmful content. And of course, once you have all of this knowledge and this insight, you can then work to correct the issues that you have discovered. The third principle, employ content provenance with adversarial misuse in mind. Now, those of you who are in this room are probably very familiar with content provenance as a concept. It's very well covered, tracking the origins of a piece of digital content, including how it was made and sometimes its history of edits. Now, content provenance, just like all of the other principles here, is not a silver bullet, especially in the child safety space, but it is an impactful pillar of responsible development when it is done with adversarial misuse in mind. The goal here is specifically to support victim identification, making it possible for law enforcement and hotline analysts to reliably distinguish between reported content that is AI-generated, AI-manipulated, or unaltered. And the reality is, with the adversarial nature of online offenders, strategies that are not robust to adversarial misuse will not hold up in the long term. If we move now to the deploy principles, the first is to safeguard generative AI products and services from abusive content and conduct. Now, this principle really benefits from existing strategies for protecting platforms, surfacing prevention messaging to users that are trying to produce this content, or setting up user reporting pathways, detecting at the inputs and outputs of generative AI system for attempts to produce abuse material and abuse material that may have been produced. These are all strategies for safeguarding platforms that predate generative AI, have been impactful in other spaces, and are very applicable in this setting, in particular for closed source systems. Second, responsibly host models. Now, this concept is one that we apply to both those who are only providing access to models that they have built in-house, first-party providers, as well as third-party model providers, those who are hosting models that were built by developers outside of their organization, as is more common in the open source ecosystem. In either case, it really comes down to this concept of elevating moderation from the image, the video, or the text to the model itself, setting up the processes, the systems, and the policies necessary to ensure that this kind of moderation happens at the model level, So you are only hosting models that have already first been evaluated for their capability to produce abuse material, and you are taking down those hosted models that have been optimized to produce abuse material, that is their explicit intent, and disallowing these types of models to be hosted on your platform. Third, encourage developer ownership and safety by design. There is an opportunity here at this deploy stage to create a pause point for developers, to ask them to consider and document. We heard about transparency measures in the last talk, to ask them to consider, document, and transparently share what type of child safety measures they have put in place before releasing their model. Now, model cards are already an industry standard mechanism for developers to document and share details on how they develop their models, and could certainly provide a natural pathway for this pause point for both open and closed source. Now, if I haven't lost you, we have finally made it to maintain. First, prevent services from scaling access to harmful tools. As I said earlier, offenders have built models that are specifically designed to produce abuse material of particular children, and they have also built services that are being monetized and used to nudify content, benign material of kids. We can and we should limit access to these harmful tools by removing them from platforms and search results. Second, invest in research and future technology solutions. Now, this particular principle was written with the clear knowledge that child sexual abuse online is a continuously evolving threat, that offenders adopt new technologies in their efforts. It was also written knowing that tech really moves fast. And if your own tech stack outpaces your safety interventions, your efforts are not going to be that effective. So combating this misuse in an impactful way will require continued research and technology development to stay up to date. Finally, fight child sexual abuse material, AI-generated and exploitative material on platforms. Now, while these principles are focused on generative AI, the reality is that this type of misuse in furthering child sexual abuse and exploitation doesn't happen in isolation. It happens as part of many other connected and related harms. So to be effective, platforms need to take a holistic approach across these harms. Now, as part of this initiative, we released a paper called Safety by Design for Generative AI, Preventing Child Sexual Abuse. I think I am already running late on time, and so I will just say if you are interested, you can find it on Thorn's website. There is more material in addition to the principles that provides more detail across some of the recommendations. And again, for the sake of time, I won't go through the specifics of some of these recommendations. Now, we did write these principles and mitigations to be as straightforward as possible to allow for folks to hit the ground running and be impactful in their efforts. But there are certainly some complexities that are worth unpacking. So I'm going to take a little bit of time now to unpack one of the mitigations that does come up quite a lot in broader conversation around generative AI, model assessment. Now, when it comes to model assessment, you may think intuitively that this is fairly straightforward. Is your model capable of generating abuse material? Is it incapable? Is it capable when it's explicitly prompted to? Has it been optimized for this purpose? That all of these types of categories are fairly intuitive. When it comes to assessing for child sexual abuse material and exploitation in particular, there are some specific challenges. Now, the first one is actually applicable across the ecosystem. We are missing scalable solutions for assessing models in general. Now, this is particularly relevant to those model hosting platforms that host thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of models every day. There is an incredibly rapid scale and pace of model development, and so solutions, this actually ties to the reliance on prompting strategies, solutions that aren't inherently manual, that aren't tied to trying a prompt and seeing what the model produces, are going to be necessary in order to meet the pace of the moment. Now, we believe that more technical research will be needed here. Things like extracting directly from the model weights any knowledge or insights on the presence of child sexual abuse material that may have been used in the model's training data. Another challenge I'll highlight is the lack of standardized evaluation data sets. These types of standardized assessments and the associated gold standard testing data sets are really crucial. They allow for consistency and transparent evaluation of a model's propensity for generating this kind of abuse material. But child sexual abuse material is illegal for a reason. You can't just go out and find an open source data set to use to evaluate your model. And so there is a critical role here that government, law enforcement, and standard setting bodies will need to play in order to be able to contribute to this type of assessment. Now, for the sake of time, I am going to keep going forward. Apologies for having to skip some content. So we are now in phase 2 of our initiative since the initial launch has been complete, and our focus at this stage is on adoption and accountability. Our strategy needs to cover a broad range of types of engagement, as the reality is that many companies will come join into voluntary commitments, and they will keep them. Some companies will join into voluntary commitments, and they will not keep them, or they will not keep them at a pace necessary to have impact. And some companies are never going to come to the table at all. So to that end, we have 3 core pillars to this second phase of our initiative. The first is publishing progress reports with insights from the committed companies. The second is collaborating with standard-setting institutions to integrate our efforts into their existing work to scale the reach of these principles and mitigations. And the last is to engage with policymakers so that they can understand what is both technically feasible and also impactful in this space. Looking at each of these lines of work, so far for progress reports, we have published 3 progress reports highlighting progress and opportunities across 3 of the committed companies, Civitai, Metaphysic, and Invoke AI. Our annual progress report that will provide insight from the remaining companies is slated to be released in Q4 later this year. So far, what we've heard from companies is that they have blocked hundreds of thousands of attempts to generate abuse material, child sexual abuse material, that they have retroactively removed from their platforms hundreds of models optimized for generating child sexual abuse material, and that they have audited their training data sets for their generative AI models to ensure these data sets do not contain child sexual abuse material. Some areas where we see more progress needed includes implementing pre-hosting assessments for new models, exploring user reporting functionality for open source software offerings, and strengthening provenance measures to be robust against adversarial misuse. If you're interested in reading more of the details, these blogs are all, the reports are all publicly available. Now for standard setting, there are 2 work streams, one complete and one ongoing, that I will highlight today. The first is a Thorn-led effort in 2024, IEEE, which for those of you who don't know what that is, it is the world's largest technical professional organization dedicated to advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. They approved a working group to establish a official IEEE recommended practice that is building off of the earlier initiative's white paper. The other is a standard that was produced by NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Their standard setting process involves soliciting feedback on drafts from external stakeholders, and we were glad to be invited to provide early guidance and substantial feedback throughout the drafting process into their NIST AI 100-4 standard, reducing risks posed by synthetic content, that is also available on NIST's website. For policy, I'll highlight one work stream that recently completed in August of this year. Thorn was one of the civil society organizations that was selected to provide input throughout the drafting process for the EU AI Act Code of Practice, which is the first regulatory tool in the world for governing AI. We were provided the opportunity to provide input into 2 of the chapters specifically. Throughout this process, we advocated for data-driven and technically feasible requirements for general-purpose AI providers that, again, would prevent the misuse of general-purpose AI models. We were glad to see some solutions that are, again, data-driven and technically feasible, included things like assessments for CSAM as a systemic risk, model documentation requirements for providers to describe the methods that they have used to remove CSAM from training data. Now, I'd like to close with one last thought. Safety by design focuses on tech companies for a reason, but at the end of the day, tech companies are people. And for people to live out the ethos of proactive safeguarding core to safety by design, it requires all of us to take ownership of what we build, to recognize that what we build may not get used in the way that we intend. It may, in fact, get used in really terrible ways. But rather than let that knowledge overwhelm us, we need to turn it into fuel to have impact, to use our creativity, our intellect, and our drive to build better, to build thoughtfully, and to build in a way that elevates the most vulnerable among us, these kids, who deserve to be put first. So if you are interested in being a part of that change, in joining into these commitments, or learning more, please do not hesitate to reach out. I would be glad to talk. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry for going over. I appreciate it.